the SS Arctic. Despite the name, not actually meant for necessarily cold environments, at least not extreme cold, she was named after the ocean, and she was an American paddle steamer, which was owned by the Collins Line. A paddle steamer is exactly what it sounds like. It's a steamship, but it's one that uses a big paddle instead of a prop. Paddle steamers used to be used on the open ocean, but over time paddles started falling out of favor, and these days you'll usually only find them on preserved riverboats. In fact, the only remaining seagoing paddle steamer is the PS Waverly, built as late as 1946 actually. Regardless, they were mostly seen during the 1800s and early 1900s, but slowly as ships got bigger, larger props started being used. But some enjoy the paddle steamers. They have a unique charm, and indeed, SS Arctic was one of them. The story of the SS Arctic can be traced back to the, well, idea of steamships in general. The steam engine didn't just revolutionize, long-distance travel on land in the form of railways, it also changed ocean travel, because you could use a steam engine to power a ship, which up until that point had all been powered via the wind. And the wind is a fickle mistress, as she doesn't actually obey the laws of man, and only herself. The wind does what it wants. We really have no input regarding how the wind is going to operate. Thus, the steam engine offered a much more reliable method of power, because, well, we were in full control of it effectively. But the transition period between sail and steam was pretty gradual, not instantaneous like you'd think. That was because there was still skepticism surrounding steam power as a whole. A lot of ship owners and builders thought that ships couldn't actually carry enough coal to traverse the entire ocean. This isn't true, to be clear, especially as the technology evolved and got more efficient. But for a while, ships would have both sails and steam engines. But in 1838, it was finally completely disproven that you couldn't carry enough coal to make the crossing, due to two different crossings that happened basically at the same time. The British-built SS Great Western and the American-built SS Sirius. Both would make trips across the Atlantic without actually, needing to get more coal like they did it completely with just the steam engines, meaning that, we don't actually need these sails anymore. That's neat. And who really pushed the technology forward was the British because, masters of the sea and all that, in the form of the Cunard Line, or the British and North American Royal Mail Steam Packet Company. Nobody calls it that. Everyone calls it the Cunard Line, after the founder, a Canadian man actually, named Samuel Cunard. Cunard began operations July 4th, 1840, utilizing RMS Britannia, and they were the principal transatlantic mail carrier, meaning that they received subsidies from the British government as well as from the United States Post Office Department. That latter example caused some problems here in America because we were like, why are we funding the British in this? We don't fund the British. This is taxation without representation. Raw American noises. It wasn't taxation. It was just they were delivering our mail. It wasn't anything like that. But it was still a matter of, why are we dumping money into a foreign economy when he could be crossing the Atlantic on our own and funding an actual American company to do that? Thus, certain congressmen began pressuring the government in general to start subsidizing our own steamship line rather than, Britain's. And in 1845, the Postmaster General did invite tenders for a transatlantic mail contract. A successful bidder was finally chosen and announced on March 3rd, 1847, a New York-based ship owner, Edward Knight Collins. The government subsidies were pretty substantial for the time, $385,000 a year. That's in mid-1800s money, so it was a lot. And Collins also received further financial backing from the Brown Brothers Bank. And as a result, he would found the New York and Liverpool United States Mail Steamship Company, which was generally referred to as the Collins Line. So Cunard versus Collins. That's how this worked. And he had a pretty big vision for his company, pushing forward a large steamship construction program, which included 4 initial ships. The first of which was the SS Atlantic, launched in 1849, beginning her transatlantic service in April of 1850. She would wind up with 3 different sisters: Pacific, Baltic, and Arctic, all of which were in service by the end of 1850. All the ships were built of wood, because mid-1800s, a lot of ships were still made mostly of wood, but they were steamships, paddle steamships, and were mostly identical, but true to a lot of ocean liner families, they weren't exactly identical. There were some nominal differences between the sisters. In Arctic's case, she was actually the largest, being a little bit longer and a little bit heavier than her other siblings, at 284 feet, 87 meters. But all the ships were pretty big. They were all bigger than the ships Cunard had at the time, and were pretty quickly starting to outperform them, able to cross the Atlantic in just 10 days. Arctic herself would enter service on October 26, 1850, and a big push for Collins was to not only make the trips fast, but also nice. Nice trips. See, Cunard was operating off the principle of just get people on the boat and get them to where they're going. A very modern airline, actually, in that way. But Collins felt that because the ships were so large, there was no reason to not make them enjoyable to be on as well. Because at least with modern airlines, you don't expect to be on the plane for more than a few hours tops, depending on how long the flight is, obviously, but definitely not more than, say, a day, let alone 10 of them. So Collins wanted his ships to be enjoyable experiences in and of themselves. And one of the big complaints about Cunard was the fact that it really wasn't that much fun to be on the ships. Famous writer Charles Dickens would remark regarding his experience on Britannia that his cabin was a thoroughly hopeless and profoundly preposterous box. Very Dickens. Very Dickens. The man had a way with words. He was one of those famous writers in history. I mean, I don't know what you expected. And the saloon was a long, narrow apartment, not unlike a gigantic hearse. He really didn't like the Britannia, is where we're at with it. He did not have a good time, but he also traveled on the Arctic, and he had a much different experience when it came to her. Regarding his cabin, he said that its comfort and elegance surpassed that of any merchant vessel Great Britain then possessed, and her saloon was an air of almost oriental magnificence. Basically, he loved the Arctic. He had a great time. And that was true to form for the Collins ships. They were all very nice to be on. And at face value, that meant that you'd think they would completely outperform Cunard, but Collins' line would suffer some significant setbacks. Financial mismanagement, as well as unprecedented horrific disaster. Quickly enough that they couldn't even recover from it. But prior to that, the Arctic had a really good reputation, especially because of her captain, James Luce. Captain Luce was a highly experienced seaman, 49 years old, and had been sailing for 30 years. Under his command, the Arctic was one of the most celebrated Collins ships, and she set a record eastbound crossing from New York to Liverpool in 9 days and 17 hours in the winter of 1851 and 52. Luce was incredibly well-liked, not just because he was highly skilled, but also he was a really nice guy. He was very friendly, very polite, and made it a point to greet all the passengers whenever he could, and treat them all with dignity and respect. Pretty much everyone that sailed aboard the Arctic remember her for her comfort, and her captain for his ability. But sadly, this would not last. It was the middle of the afternoon, September 20th, 1854, when Arctic would leave Liverpool, bound for New York, for the final time. Her exact passenger count isn't known with certainty, but it was somewhere between 230 and 280, as well as 150 crew members. Among the passengers was Mrs. Edward Collins, the wife of Edward Collins, the owner of the line, as well as her 19-year-old daughter Mary Ann and 15-year-old son Henry Coit. Mrs. Collins was also with her brother and his wife. Another particularly well-to-do party were members of the Brown banking family, who, remember, had financed this entire arrangement. William Benedict Brown was the son of the bank's president, and he was with his wife Clara, their 2 infant children, and 2 of William's sisters as well. Captain Luce was in command, and had brought his partially disabled 11-year-old son on the trip too. His name was William Robert. The kid was in poor health, but Luce was a loving and caring father, and he thought that the trip might actually be better for his son's health, likely thinking that the fresh sea air would be good for him. It's not an unreasonable thought for a caring father. Fresh air on board one of the most luxurious liners around, which was under his own dad's command, would at least be better for the kid's mood. Arctic would pass Cape Clear early on the morning of September 21st. That's the southernmost point of Ireland, meaning that they were heading into the open Atlantic and approaching her maximum speed of a blistering 13 knots, 15 miles per hour. The Arctic was not a fast ship. She was fast by the standards of the time, but not by our standards. Titanic was faster than that. There was more technology to work out in terms of making the ships go faster. But she was at full speed, and that was fine, because weather all across the Atlantic was extremely calm. Arctic performed appropriately, the crew took care of the passengers had a nice time, there were really no issues at all. Thus, there was no reason for Arctic to slow down, though it is worth mentioning that even if there was a reason for her to slow down, that was not common practice. Speed was the essence of everything when it came to company operations, so even in situations where you might think about, not going that fast, that wasn't normal. Regardless, at the time, there wasn't a reason to slow down, so Arctic just kept on going, and early on September 27th, she had finally reached the Grand Banks off the coast of Newfoundland. This area is notoriously finicky, shall we say, for sailors because of the currents. In that spot, the subarctic waters of the Labrador Current, coming from the north, meet the warm northbound waters in the Gulf Stream. This mixture of hot and cold can result in a lot of kooky weather patterns, but more commonly, it causes a lot of intermittent mists and fog, which naturally, as you can imagine, make visibility rather poor, assuming they show up. And they do show up, and did show up that day. But, as I mentioned, it was common practice for steamers to maintain maximum speeds even in conditions such as that, despite it being risky and stupid in retrospect. But keeping to schedules was more important. The Collins Line, in particular, was notoriously pushy about that. Keeping to timetables was the #1 priority, even over common sense safety logic. Luce was well aware of the risky situation he was suddenly in, and though he maintained speed as he was supposed to, he did take every other precaution he possibly could, and kept tabs on their location, because the biggest risk, logically, was running aground. If they went the wrong way, they just wouldn't see, shallows or rocks or anything. And by noon, the fog was still a problem. Luce had calculated the position of his ship at roughly 50 miles southeast of Cape Race in Newfoundland, meaning they were still pretty much on course and there shouldn't be any problems, but as soon as they entered yet another fog bank, one of the lookouts reported that he was seeing a shape of another steamer bearing down on them at a rate of roughly 10 knots. He immediately shouted a warning, and the officer of the watch commanded a hard starboard, as well as ordering the engine room to enter reverse. Luce wasn't actually on deck when this was going on. He was in the chart room checking their position, but he heard the shouting and immediately returned to his post, just in time to see the Arctic slammed into by the other steamer on her starboard side, between her bow and the paddle wheel. The steamer that had ran into the Arctic was the SS Vesta, captained by a 30-year-old man, Alphonse Duchesne. Vesta was an iron-hulled ship, propeller-driven, owned by a French company, technically built as a fishing ship, but at that moment was being used to ferry the company's employees to and from their center of operations on Saint Pierre Island. And at first, everyone kinda got the situation wrong. Mainly, Vesta looked way, way, way worse than Arctic did. Even Captain Luce didn't believe his ship had sustained any serious injuries. Whereas Vesta's entire bow had been crushed inward like a tin can, and her crew seemed to be running around in panic, while everything on Arctic was pretty chill. Even the passengers weren't really concerned, as according to accounts from survivors, to them, the impact only felt like a slight bump. This wasn't a loud, screeching, horrific noise. This was just a bump, as far as they were concerned. Whereas on Vesta, yeah, she wasn't looking so hot. Because of this early assessment, Luce felt his first priority was to help Vesta and throw blame around for the incident later, because he thought that she was in danger of sinking pretty much immediately. So he ordered his first officer, Robert Gourlay, to lower one of Arctic's 6 lifeboats. Yes, she only had 6, just so we're clear. And no, she did not have enough for everybody on board. I don't know why you thought that. This is way before the Titanic disaster, don't be silly. But Chief Officer Robert Gourlay took one of the lifeboats and 6 other men to row over to Vesta to see if they could help at all, while Arctic maintained a safe distance and circled the vessel to await word regarding what the captain of the Vesta wanted them to do. They were in the middle of launching another lifeboat under the command of Second Officer William Belham, but Luce would rescind that order because he started noticing something questionable. His ship, which again he had thought, and everyone had thought, was pretty much fine, was listing to starboard and settling by the bow. This is not fine. There was also a change of movement to her paddle wheels through the water. Something was wrong. Pretty badly wrong. So, instead of sending Belham out, Luce sent him below deck to make a closer inspection of the impact site to see, hey, are we flooding? Belham went to check and discovered that, oh no. Debris from Vesta, as well as her anchor, had actually impaled in the woodwork of Arctic's hull. That caused serious breaches, 2 of which were below the waterline, and allowing a pretty substantial amount of water to just enter the ship, as water tends to do. And this was a serious problem for Arctic because there was one major difference, one key design feature that Vesta had, that Arctic didn't. Vesta had watertight compartments. Oh yes, Vesta could seal off damaged areas, particularly, the part that had been crushed in. Arctic had no watertight bulkheads, compartments, nothing. At all. It just wasn't designed into her. She was open, from stem to stern. Meaning that if she was flooding, there was absolutely nothing to stop the water from continuing to do that. When Belham reported back, Luce realized, oh, shoot, okay, we actually are in some serious trouble. Instead of the obvious crushing that Vesta took, Arctic's wound was more like a deep stabbing of a knife. It wasn't necessarily obvious or large, but the bleeding was serious, and mortal in Arctic's case. Her pumps were turned on, she had 4 of them, and they were working at full capacity, and Luce made attempts to staunch the leak. His first idea was to use a large canvas sail, stretching it over the leak in order to slow down the entry of water, which might have actually worked, except that because there was jagged iron bits protruding out of Arctic, it just tore through the sail and it didn't do anything. He also tasked the ship's carpenter with doing anything to try to keep the water out, and he did, going as far as to grab mattresses to throw over the holes, but nothing was working. The holes were too far below the waterline to be reached effectively, meaning that Luce was quickly running out of options. But they weren't that far from land, so his thought was if they could make a run for it, heading towards the shallows, at least beach her close enough where people could, just swim to shore, that was better than sinking where they were. By his own estimates, Cape Race was about 4 hours away. That was a pretty long time, and given how much water was coming in, they probably wouldn't be able to make it, but he still thought they should give it a try while they still could. But this decision meant they would leave Vesta behind, as well as his chief officer, who, remember, had taken a lifeboat over to help Vesta. But Luce's reasoning was that if they stayed, it wouldn't matter because they were going down. Then they'd have 2 sunken ships right there, and everyone scrambling, and it would just be a complete disaster. He figured his best option in this really awful situation was to just make a go of it and send help back to Vesta later. So he ordered full speed ahead, but this immediately went wrong pretty quick because they accidentally plowed into a lifeboat that had been launched from Vesta. All but one of the dozen men that were inside were killed, crushed in Arctic's paddle wheel, so that's horrifying. Thank you for that. But one survivor was pulled on board, Justinette Francois, who was able to jump clear before the impact and was hauled on board Arctic by a rope. Though he was out of the frying pan and into the fire, or out of the water and into the flooding. I don't know what metaphor I'm going for. He was out of the water, yes, but he was on board another sinking ship. It wasn't really a great situation for him. He was having a day, but Arctic pressed forward, trying her best to reach the shallows before she actually went under. But the problem was, as the water rose, it started to extinguish the boiler fires, meaning that she was losing boiler pressure, and therefore losing power. By 1 o'clock, she was basically not moving at all, and still pretty far from land, meaning Luce therefore began ordering that the ship's lifeboats be prepared to launch. As I mentioned, she had 6 steel-built lifeboats, but because Gourlay had taken 1 to help Vesta, remember, she only had 5, and in total, the 5 remaining boats could safely hold about 150 people, which was not even close to the amount of people that were still on board the Arctic, as you might imagine, and even with the 6th one, it still wouldn't have been enough. But Luce realized that there was enough room for the women and children. So, true to form, especially at the time, it was ordered that women and children be put on the boats first. Under charge of the ship's quartermaster, women and children were placed in the port guard boat, but very quickly, chaos started to erupt. Slowly but surely, things were getting out of hand. Because, unlike Titanic, where the passengers didn't quite realize how bad the situation was at first, and therefore panic took some time to set in, everyone on board Arctic kinda knew what was happening pretty quick. And also, unlike Titanic, Arctic's crew was not nearly as disciplined or professional or honorable as Titanic's crew was. I bring this up because, very quickly as they started loading the lifeboats, ostensibly, it was supposed to be women and children first. In many cases, that didn't happen. A group of male passengers for the port guard boat, for example, which also included members of the crew, male members of the crew, rushed forward and filled the remaining places before the women and children. The boat had also been ordered to remain alongside the sinking Arctic, but instead was rowed rapidly away from her, and not staying to help whatsoever. As the other boats were also loaded, panic set in, as even the passengers started realizing that there wasn't enough room for all of them. The port quarter boat was loaded with around 12 women and 5 crew, was then also rushed by more members of the crew. In the struggle, this boat was upended, sending all but 3 of its occupants into the water, where they all drowned. While this was going on, Luce was on the other side of the ship, ordering Belham to launch the starboard guard boat and take it over to the stern, where women and children passengers could be passed down to it. It was launched, where it was quickly overwhelmed by men, who leapt into the water and clambered onto the boat, and all but one of those men were, again, crew members. The crew weren't doing their jobs whatsoever. They were trying to save themselves. The upended port quarter boat had been righted, but was again rushed by crew and more male passengers, who pushed the waiting women and children aside and took the lifeboat away, only partially full. Luce, by this point, knew he was losing control of the situation and tried desperately to impose order upon his crew. But basically, nobody was listening to him. A group of the ship's engineers, led by the chief engineer, J.W. Rogers, took control of one of the 2 remaining lifeboats. They offered the explanation that they were taking the boat for a final attempt at plugging the leaks, and also anyone who questioned this or attempted to board the boat was threatened with guns. So, yeah. That boat left half full, entirely with engine room staff. So that's good. And of all the ship's officers, only Luce himself and the 4th officer, Francis Dorian, remained on board. All the engineers were gone, and almost all the seamen had left. But that left 300 people on board. Pretty much all of them were the passengers. The women and children passengers, too. This was a disaster. And all they had left was a single lifeboat. Luce, in a desperate bid to save even more people, ordered the building of a makeshift raft. The fore and main yardarms, various beams, spars, and any other pieces of wood they could find were collected and lashed together. Dorian took the remaining lifeboat out and attempted to supervise the construction of the raft. He was doing his job, to his credit. But once again, not only was his lifeboat quickly overwhelmed with desperate people trying to not die, forcing Dorian to cut loose of the sinking Arctic because they were going to swamp his own lifeboat, but that left the remainder of the passengers scrambling onto the half-finished raft, which could not support their weight and quickly was deemed pretty much useless. Now, every single lifeboat was gone, and Arctic was quickly going down. Luce instructed one of his only remaining crew members, a young man, a trainee engineer, Stuart Holland, from Washington, D.C., to station himself at the bow and fire the ship's signal cannon at 1-minute intervals. The idea was to try to attract the attention of a passing vessel, even in the thick fog, in the hopes that anyone, would come and render aid, because it was pretty much their only hope. Holland was an example of one of the only honorable members of Arctic's crew, as he remained at his post till the final gasp of the ship. His last words, which were allegedly said to Captain Luce, were, "Let it be known that one crewman aboard this ship did not abandon his post." He did not survive the sinking. Another member of the crew that chose to remain at her post was a black stewardess named Anna Downer. She wound up placed in charge of a hand pump, trying desperately to keep water out of the ship as long as possible. She continued doing this, even as her hands bled, and most of the other crew had abandoned the ship. Captain Luce himself would go down below decks and relieve her of this duty, basically telling her, "Look, there's no point, but you did a great job." But Anna didn't stop, saying, "Captain, I'm willing to pump as long as I can work my arms." She also went down with the ship. Even as the Arctic was breathing her last, Luce chose to stay with her, not taking any action to save himself, but focusing on trying to save as many other people as possible, as any true captain would. When he could no longer render any substantial assistance to anyone else, he climbed up with his 11-year-old son, who was with him, remember, atop his command post, which was above the starboard paddle box, to await the Arctic's final plunge. By this time, according to survivors' accounts, the mood on board was depressing, but less panicky than it had been. Most had become resigned to their fate, huddled together for comfort, and even some sang hymns and recited scripture, praying for a miracle. Some still tried to find a way to survive, even attempted to create yet another raft, using anything that would possibly float. Chairs, stools, caskets, whatever they could get their hands on, it didn't matter. They were doing their best to survive. And Holland stayed with his cannon, firing as he had been ordered. This second makeshift raft did partially work, though it wound up damaged after hitting the Arctic's hull. According to one of the survivors, a waiter named Peter McCabe, he said there were 72 men and just 4 women, either on or clinging to the side of the raft as it floated away from the Arctic. At 4:45 p.m., 4.5 hours after she'd been struck by the Vesta, the cannon Holland was responsible for fired for the final time as Arctic sank into the ocean, stern first. Captain Luce clung to his son tightly as he was dragged down by the sinking Arctic, but rose to the surface again, surrounded by over 200 people, mostly women and children, struggling in the water, crying out for help, and trying to find anything to cling to in order to stay afloat. The water was also very cold, so that wasn't helping. Luce continued struggling himself, hanging on to his son, but as he did so, a section of one of Arctic's paddle boxes rose to the surface, striking him, but actually killing his son right in front of him. Luce somehow, after experiencing all this horrific trauma, losing his ship, his crew abandoning him, and now losing his son, still pulled himself on top of the now floating paddle box, which would provide a temporary raft for himself and 11 of the other survivors. Captain Luce and the others would stay clung to that debris for 2 days. They would be found about noon on September 29th by the sailing ship Cambria. 3 of the other lifeboats had also been picked up early on, but the other 3 actually have unknown fates. The starboard quarter boat that was taken by Chief Officer Gourlay to assist Vesta kind of disappeared. No one knows what happened to him. That was good. The port guard boat, which was launched under the control of the quartermaster, also vanished without a trace. And the third one, taken by J.W. Rogers and the other engineering staff who, remember, took the boat with firearms and refused to let anyone in and lied about why they were using it. Yeah, they disappeared too. And that one in particular, given the general attitude and the fact they were abandoning everyone else, and I understand that they died mysteriously and we never know what happened to them, but given the context, I'm a little bit on the side of...
Oh no! Anyway...
The only trace of these missing lifeboats was found in mid-December. The port guard boat was found washed ashore at Placentia Bay in Newfoundland, but the occupants weren't there, despite the fact that the boat itself was fine. News of the Arctic's loss finally reached Collins' headquarters in New York on October 11th. Survivors would arrive and were immediately interviewed by the press, but the full truth wouldn't come out until much later, as much of the survivors were the crew, remember, who had just run away and left the passengers to die horribly, so they kind of maybe sort of lied a little bit regarding how they survived, and just a few, just a little bit of embellishments and some facts that were conveniently left out. And it wasn't until Luce telegraphed his own report on October 13th that the whole truth finally came out. For one thing, he told Edward Collins himself, almost immediately, that among the lost passengers included his wife, daughter, and son. The members of the Brown family also went down with the ship, and Luce was the one to be like, yeah, my crew was actually trash, and stole the lifeboats when I specifically ordered them not to do that, and to let women and children go first, as is proper. My son is horrifically dead. Luce was going through it, alright? He was totally over the situation. When word spread of this issue, the press became decidedly less supportive of the crew as they had been. The general public quickly became furious with them, and very quickly press accounts became much harsher, referring to them as cowardly and dastardly, which, yeah, that's right, that's fair. Luce, for what it's worth, was given much of a reprieve and wasn't overly criticized because, frankly, everyone kind of accepted the fact that his crew was just trash. He had done everything he could. All the orders he gave were appropriate. It's just no one listened to him. Plus, he had technically at least attempted to go down with the Arctic, but he had survived by pure dumb luck. And when he arrived in New York on October 14th, he was greeted as a hero, though some would eventually criticize him, saying that he had failed to inspire appropriate discipline. But, okay, look, guys, I know we could say that, but also I feel like this crew was just awful. That's kind of where I'm at with it. Like, everyone just decided, yeah, today we're gonna not do our jobs at all. That's what we're gonna do. The worst part is that, based on the fact they had managed to construct 2 makeshift rafts, 2, had they actually done things appropriately and orderly, they probably could have gotten everyone flotation devices and most of them would have survived. But instead they behaved like cowards and jerks, and most people died horribly. That's good. Additionally, incredibly, among the survivors was Vesta. Yeah, Vesta didn't actually sink. Those watertight compartments totally worked. She was fine. I mean, she wasn't fine, but she was repaired and remained in use until at least 1875, so yeah, that was also a thing. But the disaster really painted a bad image for the Collins line, as despite their opulence, people started thinking of them as unsafe. And even though there were calls to improve safety, they were largely ignored. In January of 1856, Arctic's sister, SS Pacific, would also sink, with all lives on board lost. And though Collins went ahead and constructed an even larger ship, the SS Adriatic, the company soon started losing money significantly. Mostly because the public's opinion was that the government money, because remember they were getting subsidies, was being used for these extra bits, these extravagances, the fancy stuff, and not on, like, keeping people alive. Those subsidies were heavily cut back in 1858, and the Collins line revealed that basically they'd been depending on them, and thus they ceased business, leaving Cunard virtually unopposed in the transatlantic trade, at least for a bit of time. As for Captain Luce, one of the few people that did his job during this entirely horrific situation, well, the ghosts of what happened that day, the loss of his son, the loss of his ship, the betrayal of his crew, would never leave him. He acknowledged his own personal mistakes, saying he probably shouldn't have abandoned his chief officer, who might have been able to help him instill proper order, and he would never go to sea again. He took a post as an inspector of ships with the Great Western Marine Insurance Company, where he worked until his death at the age of 75 in 1879. His obituaries recorded that his latter years were embittered by the recollection of the terrible disaster, indicating that the man likely suffered from what we would call PTSD, and who could blame him? This was awful for everybody involved, especially him. This man had watched his son die in front of him in his arms after his ship sank, after his crew decided to betray him. This was not a situation that most people would psychologically recover from with any good order, and the fact that he still was able to take a job and work, not on sea, but still work, and live to the age of 75 is a testament to his own grit and professionalism. He deserved better, all things considered, as did all the innocent lives that were lost. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.